Tonight, I'm excited to welcome Robin Black to Harvard Bookstore to read from her debut short story collection, If I Loved You, I Would Tell You This. Ms. Black earned her MFA at Warren Wilson College. Her stories and essays have appeared in the Southern Review, One Story, Alaska Quarterly Review, the Best Creative Nonfiction, and other publications. She has received grants from the Leeway Foundation and the MacDowell Colony, among other honors, and she has taught at Arcadia University and Bryn Mawr recently. If I Loved You, I Would Tell You This is Ms. Black's first collection, and it has earned her comparisons to Alice Munro, Lori Moore, Mary Gaitskill, and other big names in short fiction. Amy Bloom, author of Away, said of the collection, Robin Black knows people, she knows us, and she offers us back to ourselves in clear-eyed and graceful prose. And Kirkus Reviews called the book a poignant and auspicious debut.
Thank you, and thanks very much to Harvard Bookstore for this, and thanks to all of you for coming. As anyone who's looked at the book knows, I write very, very long short stories, so I never get to make it through a full one in a reading, and I won't this time either. I'm just going to read the opening of the last story that I wrote for the book. The book took 8 years, 10 stories in 8 years, which, I get points for persistence, if not speed. And the last story I wrote, it's not the last one in the book, but it's the last one I wrote. I finished 8 years to the week after the first one I started. And I always say that the first one took about a week, and the last one took about 6 months. And it's just sort of a lesson in how non-linear progress is when you're writing. I mean, I guess that was progress, but. So this story is. This story is called A Country Where You Once Lived. And the only other thing I'll tell you about it is that it is the only story that I wrote for the book. There was one other, this is a male point of view story, there was one other male central character story in the book, and Random House felt very strongly that they wanted it to be the first story, and I felt very strongly that it was strange to begin with a man and then have 8 stories all about women. So I had this in the back of my head, and they waited for it, which was nice. So it's called A Country Where You Once Lived, and I'm going to read about the first third of it. It isn't even a 2-hour train ride out from London to the village where Jeremy's daughter and her husband, a man Jeremy has never met, have lived for the past 3 years. But it's one of those trips that seems to carry you much farther than the time might imply. By around the halfway point, the scenery has shaken off all evidence of the city, all evidence, really, of the past century or two. Or so it seems to Jeremy, as long as he blurs his eyes to the occasional black line of motorway snaking through it all, to the dots of color speeding along the line. Otherwise, it's pretty much all mild shades of green and milling cows, sheep clustered at copses, church steeples appearing at regular intervals in a gentle, reassuring rhythm. It's a fantasy landscape, he thinks, the kind that encourages belief in the myth of uncomplicated lives. Jeremy is riding backwards, so is watching it all recede, and the sensation is oddly saddening, or maybe not so oddly saddening. A scientist, a cancer researcher, he passes his days in the flux and flow between the minute facts of molecular composition and our comparatively clunky selves. He knows well that for all the brain's cellular elegance, it has too this kind of simple, simplistic aspect to it. Leaving is sad. Even just the illusion of leaving is sad. As each view recedes, his eyes are tricked, and in turn trick his brain. He is leaving, leaving, leaving. Of course he feels sad. That's what he tells himself anyway as he rides along, that his settling melancholy is at least in part the mechanical product of a cause and effect process of sensory input and reflexive response. Maybe it will wear off as the day goes on, he tells himself. The reason Jeremy Piper has never met his son-in-law is that he hasn't seen his daughter, Zoe, in just over 4 years. The reason he hasn't seen his daughter in all that time is a bit harder to determine, some lethal blend of ancient angers and the seductive ease of separation 3,000 miles granted them 13 years earlier. In those early days back in Boston by himself, Jeremy was capable of working himself into a strangely personal anger at the Atlantic Ocean, as though it were some kind of bully standing between him and his family, as though he were overmatched. But increasingly he's aware of how much blame belongs to him. The fulcrum of his life, the fateful before and after line, was the year they all spent in London, starting June 1996. Our very own annus horribilis, his wife called it at the time. They went to England, he, Kathleen, and Zoe, so he could begin the work for which he's since garnered much acclaim, a study of the potential cancer-fighting properties of an enzyme found in a particularly deadly mushroom growing only in Britain, or, as Kathleen began saying some months in, on the potential cancer-fighting properties of an enzyme found in blah, blah, blah. Neither Kathleen nor Zoe, 16 at the time, wanted to make the move until Jeremy won Kathleen over with the argument that taking Zoe away from her thoroughly dislikable, probably criminal friends could only be a good idea. But then, just about 1 month into the stay, Zoe ran away from home with a Boston boy, a school friend, backpacking the Lake District over his summer break. And she didn't just run away. She left no word about where she had gone, no sign that she had gone under her own steam. Jeremy could only ever remember bits and moments from those 2 weeks, the ones when she was gone. Merciful amnesia, a friend once called it, except it wasn't very merciful, because only the worst of it stuck with him, or so he assumed. Like the first shock at her absence, as too many hours passed for it to be benign teenage tardiness. Like walking the streets of London night after night, as though she might have become a nocturnal creature waiting to reveal herself in the dark. Like the dawning, nightmarish realization that he himself was a suspect in her disappearance. We're not making any accusations. You wouldn't want us to leave any stone unturned. He imagined himself on trial, wrongly convicted, locked away, the headlines clever, if obvious, plays on his name. Tried, Piper, lured, own daughter. That was a uniquely vivid memory, but still there were long stretches from those days during which, for all he could ever remember, he might as well have been dead. That wasn't true of what followed her return. The difficulty was never remembering that period, but letting it go. Particularly his own trouble accepting that she hadn't been abducted, she had left of her own free will, and that she hadn't been unable to contact them, she had chosen not to. His own disbelief at the disappearance of the villain he had conjured and blamed for it all, the man who had been the target of his rage while she was gone, the object of revenge fantasies so violent and so vile, Jeremy had barely admitted them to himself. The man who had doubtless killed his daughter, doubtless done God knew what else to her, and in the process, minor collateral damage, Jeremy understood, destroyed her father. Except there was no man. There was only his Zoe, 16 years old, and sorry, really, really sorry for what she had done. Or so she said. At home he would watch her. He would study his daughter the way he studied the animals in his lab, as though doing so might provide some kind of solution. She had returned rail-thin, all eyes and bone. Her honey hair was jet black. Her lips were perpetually chapped, as though she had been drained of some essential human moisture. She looked like a wraith, otherworldly, but she did normal things. That was what kept him mesmerized. The way she sat at the kitchen table, eating yogurt. The fact that she spoke on the phone, that she listened to music, that she walked through the doorways of their elegant rented townhouse without falling to her knees at every threshold to reflect on what she had done. For reasons he never understood, Kathleen had escaped official suspicion, and she had also resisted the idea that there was a villain to the piece, so she hadn't learned to hate as elaborately as he. That was his theory, anyway, the foundation on which he built his resentment, that it had all been much easier on her. So he envied her, and he was angry at her, and about 6 weeks after Zoe's return, Jeremy embarked on a standard-issue, utterly predictable affair with a colleague at the lab, despite the fact that he didn't like the woman very much. Liking her or not liking her seemed oddly irrelevant to the decision to have sex with her a few times a week. The truth was, he wasn't a bit sure he would ever like anyone again. He seemed to have lost the thread of how affections work. Ultimately, though, the smug satisfaction of doing something behind Kathleen's back lost out to the impulse to hurt her. So one night toward the end of the year, motivated more by spite than by anything like remorse, he confessed. She looked momentarily confused. Shock at his disclosure, he assumed, then confessed her own affair right back at him. Under different circumstances, that might have signaled a chance to start over, one betrayal canceling out the other, the slate wiped clean. But as it went, they were like the dueling pair that shoots simultaneously, so both end up dead. There were never any fights after that, never even much open acrimony, just an overwhelming atmosphere of defeat in the house. With all the predictable unkindness of irony, as the family broke apart, it turned out that Kathleen and Zoe had both grown to feel at home in England, and they decided to stay on. It was while driving Jeremy to Heathrow for his miserable solo flight back to the States that Kathleen borrowed the Queen's phrase. "Our very own annus horribilis," she said, "I feel positively royal." It's Kathleen, unmistakably Kathleen, waving from the platform of the Thomas the Tank Engine station when Jeremy's train comes to its stop. "Hello, you," she calls out as he steps down. He wasn't expecting her there. He waves, a small waist-level gesture, one arm pulling a bag, the other weighted with his computer. "Hello, you," he echoes, too quietly to be heard. He's a bit numb as he walks toward her. It's been fully 5 years. He used to see her quite often at family events when she would jet over, sometimes with Zoe, sometimes alone, moving across the ocean with an ease he never thought about too clearly when cursing the Atlantic's role in his life. Over time, they progressed from avoiding each other at those events to seeking each other out as people with whom they could at least be themselves. They even once, drunkenly, stumbled into a sexual encounter that they tacitly agreed neither to repeat nor ever mention again. And the next few times they saw each other after that, he noticed they'd adopted an oddly jocular, teasing style of conversation that reminded Jeremy of the way his brother, Jonathan, and his old high school football teammates spoke to one another in middle age. But that was all years ago, as ancient in its way as their wedded days. "I wasn't expecting you," he says as they embrace. "I didn't know you'd be here." "Well." She says it with a slight shrug, as though to convey that it should be obvious why Zoe thought her presence necessary. "I hope it's at least an okay surprise. Can I help you carry anything?" "It is. No, I'm fine." He's startled by how entirely known she is to him. Not just familiar or even evocative, but inevitable in some way, as though she were the mama duck and he the little one on whom she long ago imprinted her heart-shaped face and her dark blue eyes, the straight lines of her posture, the angle at which she held her head, a certain sighing sound she would make before she spoke. As they walk toward a small lot filled with cars, he feels her settle over him like a climate in which he used to live. Driving through the village in Zoe's ancient black cockroach of a sub-compact, Kathleen points out what she calls the big sights: a tea shop, a pub, a bank, an unlikely-looking hotel covered with a profusion of ivy that Jeremy remarks appears more spooky than quaint. "There's always a fine line between the two," she says, "isn't there? It's conversation for conversation's sake. It doesn't have to make much sense." Once they've left the village and are onto country roads, she asks him if he's seeing anyone. He isn't surprised by the question. It's always been a point of honor with Kathleen to show no discomfort discussing such things. So he says that yes, he supposes he is, that yes, he is seeing someone, you could call it that. But he doesn't volunteer much more. Not that her name is Rose, a syllable he loves for sounding more like an endearment than like a real name. And not that she is 34 years old, nor that he met her when she rented the 3rd floor of the house he and Kathleen moved into the year after Rose was born. and not that he is in love with her, marrying her in 4 months. He isn't planning to tell Zoe any of these things during this visit, and Kathleen has always been a bad liar. She works in the university library, he says. Interesting. But her tone doesn't quite match the word, as though having proved that the idea doesn't disturb her, she's lost interest. Or maybe it does disturb her, and a brief display of equanimity is the best she can do. Either way, after a pause, she volunteers that she's recently ended a longish relationship with a Russian pianist, and Jeremy recognizes one of her words, longish, along with shortish, noonish, Friday-ish. A deep vein of imprecision has always run through Kathleen. I spent the whole last few months with Yuri trying to decide if he was more of a boor or a bore, until I realized it wouldn't much matter if he were out of my life. They drive in silence for a bit after that. What about Colin? He eventually asks. What's he like? Will I like him? Well, if you don't, you'll be the first, but you will. He's one of those people who doesn't ask the world to worship him, so of course everyone does, and he's very good to her. Jeremy would have given low odds on any husband of Zoe's lacking a little wash of saintliness. She seems much happier, he says, in emails, as far as I can tell, anyway. As happy as any of us, she says. As happy as any of us, he echoes a moment after that, struck, as he says it, by how happy he's been of late. Happier than most. Happier than Kathleen, it seems. She's very changed, Jeremy. You'll see. There aren't any intersections in sight when she flicks her turn signal, only property entrances, so he realizes they must be very close. She's grown up a lot, you know. But of course he doesn't know. I'm glad, he says. By nearly 30, that's the idea. We were parents at her age. That hardly means we'd grown up. Kathleen turns at a gap between high, thick hedges onto a long dirt drive. Its ruts and ridges bear witness to a persistent cycle of rain and heat. On either side, anywhere Jeremy looks, vast fields stretch, acres and acres of fields blanketing gentle hills. There are at least 3 barns in sight and a large, half-timbered house right ahead. It's as though they've gone through one of those magical gates in children's stories into a universe that couldn't possibly fit into the space concealing it. It's huge, he says. It's enormous. I hadn't expected anything on this scale. Oh, that's right. She beeps the horn with 3 sharp hits of her fist. I keep forgetting you haven't been here before. And Jeremy doesn't say anything to that. No response comes to mind. It wasn't Rose's idea that he write Zoe and ask about a visit, but it was on her account that he did. Jeremy had long been ashamed of this aspect of his life, this glaring lapse of his, this daughter across the water, but he had never before cared so much about having done something shameful. It was excruciating, telling Rose. They were walking. They liked to take walks together in the neighborhood, commenting on the houses he had lived among for 3 decades, but of course never quite seen before. They were just a few blocks from the house when she asked a question that had clearly been on her mind for some time. How often did he see his daughter? Even before hating the answer he had to give, he hated the tone in which she asked, a reluctant, eggshell-walking tone, as though she knew she was in danger of learning something about him she wouldn't like. Her voice, always low, both deep and quiet, seemed to emanate from somewhere close to the ground. Her hand tightened its grip on his, as though defiant against the impulse to unclasp it. He told her the whole story, but what did it amount to? He had let his daughter go, like a kite that requires too much attention, too much sensitivity to its ways, too much care. Rose listened, quietly, and her grip on him never loosened, but she didn't pretend it was a matter of indifference to her. In the end, though, Jeremy didn't write to his daughter because he was ashamed of himself or wanted Rose to think better of him, but because something about loving Rose, about Rose loving him, made him believe it might not be too late. The reality of his reunion with Zoe isn't a bit as he's imagined it. For one thing, he wouldn't have recognized her if he'd passed her on the street, Ever since the year in London, or since London as he thinks of it, she stayed a collection of jagged surfaces, bones poking out at her collar, on her wrists, her knees, her ribs. Her shoulder blades jutting out, straight out from her back, had seemed like vestigial wings, reminders of her flight. But now she's grown plump, round, and soft, as though nature reversed a sculptor's work, encasing her true form in this obscuring one. Her hair is back to its honey hues. The heavy goth makeup is gone. She looks like the woman he pictured her becoming when she was a child, not like the woman he believed she had become. He'd also thought there might be a moment, a few words spoken by them both, something to mark this as a new beginning. But the tentative hug they exchange in the drive and his first impressions of her become tiny details in what is quickly a bustling, comic scene that includes their reunion and also an errant cow wandering over, as though she too wants to catch up. A large dog jumping onto Jeremy, leaving prints and long muddy streaks on his pants. An ancient man on a small tractor waving, calling something unintelligible as he passes. The husband, Colin, appearing from a barn, smiling and ginger-headed, shaking Jeremy's hand, taking his suitcase. A tabby cat circling them all, a sense of rush and hurry in the air, something about the vet having been there, about dinner being close to ready, all of it conspiring to carry them through those first few minutes and through the front door of the house with a lightness that doesn't allow for anything as potentially heavy as an acknowledged fresh start. I think I'll stop there. So, as I said, that was the last one I wrote, and it took a long time. By the end of writing this book, I pretty much gotten to where I could write one story a year, which is not as productive as one might like, but so be it. I was definitely learning as I wrote, and I did get an MFA during that time, and so I actually think some of the slowness that came on was in some ways the effect of knowing more, knowing too much, knowing what decisions I had to make, you know, having so much craft suddenly in my brain that what I used to just do without thinking about it, suddenly, you know, point of view, I could think, well, wait, there's this and that has these implications and all the stuff that I didn't know. It's also true that I don't think they actually take me longer now because my process has changed. When I was writing stories when I started, which was 2001, I went to my first return writer's workshop after really not writing for about 15 years on September 10th, 2001. So I always remember the date. But at that point, I did write stories very quickly, and then I spent months and even years revising them. I mean, there are stories in here that are quite different from the published version, just because I went back years later and said, you know, no, that could be better. But now, when I write a story, I do it very differently. I don't really write it from start to finish. I write it in just whatever blocks come to mind. It's almost more of a collage exercise, and I go down a lot of paths that I don't end up following, so I throw out a lot of material. So by the time something's actually got a page one and a last page, it's already been revised in process. It's not something I would recommend to students ever, because I think it's just really idiosyncratic and where I'm at now and may not be later. But it's definitely different. And I think some of that process change is because I needed to shake myself out of the graduate school mentality. I needed to just do something completely different to get all that kind of teaching and craft stuff out of my head a little bit. So now I think I can spare myself a lot of false starts of certain types because I kind of know what the implications of things are, and a little more than I did maybe 5 years ago when I graduated. But for those years in graduate school and the first few after, it's clunky. I mean, there are actually a few other people here who went to the same program, but I think you feel kind of like, you know, wait, I've got a new kind of fork and I don't know how to use this. You know, they added 6 prongs to it or something. You know, so that there is a kind of clumsiness as you learn the craft and learn to be able to do it without stop this. It's almost a self-consciousness, I think, that creeps in from that, or did with me. I went to Sarah Lawrence long time ago, actually in 1980. And in 1981, I studied with Alan Gerganis. And Alan was really great for me in a lot of ways. He had us write a story a week for a year. It was a year-long course. And it first of all, it disabused me of the idea that everything I wrote would be good. And that's something that you really have to, I mean, I think as writers, you really have to be willing to say, you know, a lot of what I write just isn't worth keeping, and move along, you know, on to the next thing. And it just did get me in the habit of writing a lot and being productive. And then I had kids really young. I had my first child at 25 and spent about 15 years home with my kids. And I think some people have the mental energy to do both or choose to. I really didn't. In large part, the kids took up not the whole creative side of me, because I was doing painting and I was doing other things, but the word creative part, the part that was about formulating thoughts clearly. I think for about 15 years, they destroyed my ability to do that. And I was painting pottery at the time, and I was selling it. I was doing like Seder plates and bowls and stuff. And gradually, as I was doing the pottery, I started to do alphabets in the pottery, and then phrases. And it became increasingly narrative and increasingly verbal. And then it sort of culminated in this really kind of emotional, just like, gotta go say something. And I will say also, because I think it's important, that I started writing again the month after my father died. And I do think that it took me 5 years to notice that fact. Or I went, oh, I waited till Dad died. And I was very close to my father, but I think that even people you're close to, if they're large enough and their presences are somehow taking up something in your head, sometimes we just need that kind of distance or space of one kind or another. So I think that was sort of what made it permissible at that point. Well, people. I mean, I think it's a safe bet that someone will be sad about something. I mean, I don't think for whatever reasons, I turned out to be a sort of chronicler of loss and sadness, and I don't think I'm through that cycle. So I think tonally it'll be very similar to my stories, which are serious and very much about interiors of people much more than they are action. I mean, someone actually, almost seems to have gotten kidnapped in this. That's about as close as it gets to action for me. And probably, I mean, what I'll say I know is that if things stay as they are, the central figure is an older woman. And a lot of my stories are about women in their 60s and 70s. And I'm very drawn for people who are in my family will understand why. Yeah, I grew up with my grandmother in the house and all of their grandmothers to mothers. And, so there was a very female presence of older women as I was growing up. And I find older women just fascinating because of the amount of life experience they carry, and also because they kind of pass under the radar. And anytime, people are not paying a whole lot of attention to women in their 70s and 80s. And I've had a lot of close friends in that age group, and I've had them describe to me the sensation of becoming invisible. And when you have, I see nods, and when you have any population or any person who is essentially under the radar and has, by definition, is leading a kind of secret life, there's tremendous fictional opportunity there. And I love about older women the discrepancy between what people think they're seeing and what's actually going on in terms of intellect and emotion and sexuality and all of that. So I think I'll be very much in familiar territory with the book. And we'll see where that goes. I think that it's probably one of the things that's the result of my being very aware of the potential for writing overly sentimental stories because of the material I write about, which is family, it's sort of domestic fiction and sad people. And so there is, I think I have a little bit of a blunt nature when it comes to facts of life. I don't have a lot of tolerance for prettying things up, so there's that. But I also think that there is a little bit of I read today, the book was featured on the Daily Beast, and they described it was very nice, but one of the things they said was honesty just short of brutality. I thought, well, that's better than soft and squishy, I guess. That's what I was going for in some way. But so there is this sort of attempt on my part to have a matter-of-fact, non-fussiness in the prose. So I guess it is style and a little bit of personality thrown in there also. In that family, yes. In that family, absolutely. And yes. And in fact, somebody else wrote that all the men in my book are a little hapless. So that may come of growing up with, all these very strong female figures and their hapless husbands. But in the world in general, I just think women, I really believe in the whole sort of Carolyn Heilbrun's vision of invisibility, and I guess my hope for my own life in it is that there really is a certain degree of liberation in that. And I think that it's interesting, as women grow older, they tend to get bolder. And I sometimes think it's because people aren't paying as much attention to them. So they, you talk, it's like, I was talking to a woman the other day who's in her 50s. I just turned 48, and I was saying, well, in my 40s, I stopped being afraid of whether I'd offended anybody, which was like the dominant theme of my 20s and 30s. Like, did I say the wrong thing? And she said, yeah, me too. And in my 50s, I go out of my way to offend people. And I thought, well, that's a good trajectory. That's okay. Women are also the only demographic that gets more liberal as they get older, which is another interesting, yeah. But that whole, there's something, maybe it is because if I live long enough, it's my future, and I'm just very aware of what is that going to be like, not to really be noticed in the same way as, it's different at 48 from 28. It's sort of limited society we're in. So there's a book it's been shortlisted for a bunch of stuff, and it's won some stuff by this woman whom I met on Facebook called Laurie Ostland. It's called The Bigness of the World. She won the Flannery O'Connor short story thing, and I think that she is extraordinary. I think that's just in the sort of recent discovery line. I think all women my age who write are like obsessed with Virginia Woolf. I just think we all sort of went to college and fell in love with Virginia Woolf, and that was, so there's always that giant figure standing there for me. There's one story collection that was very, very influential, and oddly enough, it's about the one person I haven't ever been compared to, so maybe I still have to keep going and try to get that. It's A.S. Byatt's Little Black Book of Stories, and I think she only has 5 stories in there, and they're extraordinary. I think the best 2 of them are probably the best shorts. For me, there was just something, I don't believe in the best, but for me they were. And she taught me a lot about why write long stories. My stories now tend to be in 30 plus pages. What she was doing with that, the kinds of tension between very on-point storytelling and a kind of chaos, just because there was so much that goes into them, was something I found very appealing. And to anyone who's interested in short fiction, I think it's like the most important. I just think it's an incredibly important book. There's a story in there called A Stone Woman, which is one of the best, oddest depictions of grief that I've ever read. So I should be able to come up with some men too, because I do read men, but those are the ones that just come to mind. Anybody else? Well, thank you all very, very much for coming.